For most people, the collapse of a country looks sudden. One day the streets are calm. The government is functioning. The currency still buys something meaningful. People complain, but they always complain. Nothing seems fatal. And then, almost overnight, everything breaks. The institutions fail. The currency evaporates. The leadership fragments. And the society people thought was stable becomes unrecognizable. But collapses don't begin when the news cameras arrive. They don't begin with the riots, or the hyperinflation, or the breadlines, or the soldiers in the streets. They begin long before anyone notices. Because the destruction of a nation does not start at the borders, it starts from within. And what history shows, again and again, is that countries follow a four-stage internal cycle. A predictable pattern. A sequence so consistent that empires thousands of years apart collapse in almost the exact same way. Rome followed it. France followed it. The Soviet Union followed it. And today, other nations are moving through the same stages once again. This episode breaks down that entire cycle. Where it starts, how it accelerates, and exactly why the final stage arrives much faster than anyone expects. Stage 1. Fiscal overreach. Every collapse begins with an expansion, not a contraction. Empires grow confident. Governments grow comfortable. Budgets grow swollen. Leaders tell themselves they can manage it. They tell the public the same thing. They expand spending. They add layers of bureaucracy. They take on debts that the next decade will pay for. And when that isn't enough, they dilute the currency to fund their ambitions. The system looks strong, but beneath the surface, the foundations begin to rot. This is the first stage. The stage where collapse still feels impossible, precisely because it is already underway. Stage 2. Institutional erosion. Once the state grows beyond its capacity to sustain itself, the institutions begin to decay. Not all at once. Slowly, almost invisibly. Corruption becomes normal. Efficiency declines. Trust weakens. Rules bend for those with influence. Loyalty becomes more important than competence. Bureaucracies lose the ability to make rational decisions. Governments lose the ability to correct mistakes. And the nation loses the ability to self-repair. By this point, the collapse is not a future possibility. It is a mathematical certainty. The question shifts from if to when. Stage 3. Social fracture. When institutions fail, society breaks next. Class tensions rise. Regions turn inward. Groups blame one another for the decline. Mistrust replaces unity. You'll hear the same phrases in every empire at this stage. People are angrier than ever. No one agrees on anything. It feels like the country is slipping. These problems can't be fixed. During this stage, leaders usually try to force unity from the top, which only accelerates the fragmentation below. Societies become emotionally brittle. One unexpected shock, and everything can snap. Stage 4. System shock and rapid breakdown. This is the stage people remember. The riots, the inflation, the failed currency, the loss of order, the fall of leadership, the restructuring of power. But by the time this stage appears, the collapse is only being revealed, not created. The real destruction happened across the first 3 stages. All it takes is one triggering event. A financial crisis, a geopolitical conflict, a political scandal, a supply shock, a loss of confidence. One spark, and the entire structure falls faster than anyone expected. Leaders always insist the collapse came out of nowhere, but history shows it never does. 2. Why this playbook matters now. Around the world today, dozens of nations display signs of Stage 1 and Stage 2 simultaneously. A few are deep into Stage 3, and some, perhaps more than most people want to admit, are dangerously close to entering Stage 4. This pattern is not a prophecy. It is not a prediction. It is simply a recurring process, repeated from ancient kingdoms to modern democracies. And to understand this cycle, we must look at the empires that lived and died by it. Rome, France before the Revolution, and the Soviet Union. 3 different civilizations. 3 different eras. One identical pattern. Let's begin. 3. Chapter 1. Rome's internal decline, 100 to 476 AD. Rome did not fall because the barbarians were strong. Rome fell because Rome was weak from within. By the time the barbarians crossed the borders, the empire was already collapsing, economically, politically, and socially. 1. Fiscal overreach. Rome expanded its military far beyond sustainable levels. Defending its huge borders cost more than the empire could produce. To fund it, emperors debased the currency, reducing the silver content of coins again and again. Prices rose. Confidence fell. The economy strained under its own weight. 2. Institutional erosion. The Roman Senate lost effectiveness. Emperors rose and fell rapidly. Corruption hollowed the administrative core. Bureaucracy became a tool of personal enrichment instead of governance. 3. Social fracture. Inequality widened. Civil wars became common. Different regions stopped seeing themselves as part of one empire. Romans lost faith in the central government, the most dangerous stage of all. 4. System shock. When famine, plague, and external pressure hit, Rome shattered. But the collapse began centuries earlier, quietly, invisibly, inside the institutions and fiscal structures that kept the empire alive. Chapter 2. France before the Revolution, 1700–1790s. France did not collapse because of a single uprising. It collapsed because its internal foundations were already shattered long before the first stone was thrown at the Bastille. The French monarchy followed the four-stage playbook with almost textbook precision. Stage 1. Fiscal overreach. By the early 1700s, France was one of the richest and most powerful nations in Europe. But behind the glittering palaces and royal celebrations, the state was drowning in debt. War after war, particularly the 7 Years' War and aid to the American Revolution, drained the treasury. Instead of reducing spending, the monarchy expanded it. Court expenses rose. Royal privileges multiplied. And the financial gap between what France owed and what it could collect widened every year. Revenue structures were outdated. The nobility paid almost nothing. The burden fell on the poorest, most powerless citizens, the peasantry and small merchants. France looked strong, but the numbers told another story. Debt rose so fast that even royal advisors warned, this cannot continue. But it did. Because in Stage 1, the incentives always ensure one thing: leaders delay hard decisions until collapse becomes the only outcome. Stage 2. Institutional erosion. Once the fiscal crisis became unavoidable, France's administrative system began to crack. Corruption infected tax collection. Tax farmers kept a huge portion for themselves. Local officials acted like small kings, taking bribes for basic services. Laws differed wildly from region to region. The monarchy tried to reform the system, but every privileged group blocked the attempt. Nobles resisted taxation. Regional parliaments resisted central authority. Bureaucrats resisted oversight. Institutions that once supported the monarchy became obstacles to its survival. France entered the second stage fully. The state could no longer correct its own decline. Stage 3. Social fracture. By the 1780s, the internal pressure was reaching its breaking point. Bread prices surged after poor harvests. The public grew angry as luxury at Versailles contrasted sharply with misery in the streets. Philosophers, writers, journalists, everyone began attacking the monarchy. Different groups became hostile to one another: nobles versus middle class, clergy versus peasants, rich cities versus starving countryside, reformers versus absolutists. A nation once unified under a shared identity fractured into competing camps. Each camp believed the others were the cause of decline. Unity was gone. Trust collapsed. France had fully entered Stage 3. And then, the trigger came. 4. Stage 4. System shock. In 1788 to 1789, a series of converging shocks hit France. A massive fiscal shortfall, a failed attempt at raising taxes, a collapse in grain supply, growing unrest in Paris, bankers refusing to lend to the government. The monarchy was out of money. When Louis XVI called the Estates General to solve the crisis, he triggered a political chain reaction he could no longer control. The Third Estate broke away and declared itself the National Assembly. Protests spread across the country. Peasants revolted. The Bastille was stormed. France entered Stage 4. But the most important truth is this: the revolution did not destroy France. France had already destroyed itself long before. The revolution simply revealed the collapse that had been unfolding from within for decades. Chapter 3. The Soviet Union. A Modern Collapse. 1950s, 1991. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, most outsiders were shocked. The government was still powerful. The military was enormous. The map showed a massive empire stretching across continents. On the surface, it looked unbreakable. But internally, the four-stage playbook was already complete. Stage 1, fiscal overreach. The USSR attempted something no empire in history had done: maintain a vast global military presence, run a planned economy, subsidize dozens of industries, control prices, fund satellite states, and remain competitive with the United States, all at the same time. The costs were astronomical. The Soviet economy was producing less and consuming more. By the 1970s, the military burden alone was unsustainable. Leaders hid the numbers, but internally they knew the system was overextended beyond recovery. Stage 2, institutional erosion. Communist bureaucracy grew gigantic and rigid. Innovation slowed. Corruption became structural. Decision-making took months, sometimes years. Factories lied about production. Agriculture faked output numbers. Officials covered up failures to protect their careers. Institutions no longer functioned to strengthen the state, only to preserve themselves. By the 1980s, the system could not adapt or reform. Every attempt to fix a problem created new ones. This is the hallmark of Stage 2. The government becomes incapable of saving the country. Stage 3, social fracture. Despite the propaganda image of unity, Soviet society was deeply divided. Ethnic tensions rose. Republics grew resentful of Moscow's dominance. Citizens distrusted the state's promises. A black market economy replaced the official one. People stopped believing the government, the most dangerous shift any state can face. Confidence evaporated across the entire population. And once public confidence dies, the collapse accelerates. Stage 4, system shock. The final blow came quickly. Oil prices fell. Exports dropped. State revenue collapsed. Gorbachev's reforms destabilized the balance of power. Republics demanded independence. In 2 years, one of the world's largest empires dissolved, peacefully, but completely. Economists were stunned at the speed. But the pattern was the same as Rome and France. The collapse happened slowly, then suddenly. Because all collapses follow the same internal logic. Chapter 4, the pattern revealed across all civilizations. Now that we've explored Rome, France, and the Soviet Union, the question becomes unavoidable. How can empires separated by thousands of years, different cultures, different technologies, and different ideologies collapse in the same way? Because collapse is not about culture. It's not about language. It's not about geography. And it's not even about politics. Collapse is about incentives. The incentives inside a system determine whether it becomes stronger or whether it destroys itself from within. Every empire that falls follows the same sequence, whether it's ancient, medieval, or modern. And that brings us to the heart of this episode, the pattern. The four-stage collapse framework, unified across history. Across the 3 major case studies and dozens of others, the collapse sequence is identical beneath the surface. Stage 1, fiscal overreach. Spending increases faster than revenue. Governments take on unsustainable debts. Expansion continues despite warning signs. The currency begins weakening. Leaders postpone structural reform. Key insight: Stage 1 always feels like strength. The collapse seeds are invisible. Stage 2, institutional erosion. Corruption becomes normal. Bureaucracy becomes inefficient. Trust in institutions falls. Decision-making slows. The state becomes incapable of solving internal problems. Key insight: Stage 2 always feels like frustration, not collapse. But this is the point where decline becomes irreversible. Stage 3, social fracture. Classes turn against each other. Regions separate emotionally and politically. Public trust collapses. National unity dissolves. Conspiracy, paranoia, and anger replace cohesion. Key insight: Stage 3 feels chaotic, but still survivable. Most citizens still believe the nation can pull back from the edge. Stage 4, system shock. A triggering event hits. Institutions fail to respond. The currency collapses. The political system breaks. Power shifts to new elites. Society reorganizes around new structures. Key insight: Stage 4 is fast, violent, and often unexpected. But it is never the cause, only the reveal. 2. The speed of collapse. Why the end comes suddenly. One of the most misunderstood aspects of collapse is timing. People imagine nations decline gradually, but history shows something very different. Collapses happen slowly, then all at once. Rome took centuries to decay, but only a few decades to fall. France's fiscal issues grew for 80 years, but the monarchy fell in months. The Soviet Union decayed for decades, but dissolved in 2 years. Why? Because collapse is not linear. It is exponential. At first, problems accumulate quietly. Then, institutions lose their ability to handle those problems. Then, society loses faith in the institutions. And finally, once confidence breaks, the system crashes at breathtaking speed. Confidence is the final pillar. History proves this. When confidence goes, collapse accelerates. 3. The illusion of stability before collapse. Every empire believes it is stable right before it collapses. This illusion appears for 3 reasons. 1. Lagging indicators. Economic data often looks healthy after the internal decay has begun. 2. Complacent leadership. Leaders assume the future will look like the past, especially when they have enjoyed long periods of power. 3. The resistance to acknowledge decline. People prefer familiar lies to uncomfortable truths. So societies cling to narratives of stability while the foundations disintegrate. Rome believed it was eternal. France believed reform was still possible. The Soviet Union believed the system could be repaired. All were wrong. 4. How leaders misread the final stage. It's remarkable how consistently leaders misjudge stage 4. They believe, we still have time. We can fix this. We just need one more reform. Things will stabilize. But stage 4 accelerates faster than any political system can adapt. Here's why leaders fail. 1. They underestimate the loss of public trust. Once people stop believing the system can survive, it can't. 2. They overestimate institutional strength. Bureaucracies that decay for decades cannot suddenly become efficient. 3. They misread economic signals. Governments often confuse temporary improvements for true recovery. 4. They cannot reverse long-term incentives. The forces driving collapse have been building for years. Leaders have no way to unwind them quickly. By the time they act, the system is already broken. 5. The most important pattern of all. Across every historical example, one message stands above everything. Nations collapse from within long before the world notices. The internal signals appear first. The external shock only exposes what was already true. This pattern is repeating today. And to understand where the world is heading, we must examine the nations now moving through these stages, especially the modern superpowers. We begin with the most important one. Chapter 5, Present-Day Application, the U.S. and the Modern World. The United States is not Rome. It is not France. It is not the Soviet Union. But it is following the same internal pattern, not in identical form, but in meaningful parallels. This section examines where the U.S. stands in the 4-stage cycle, using historical patterns as the guide. 1. The United States in Stage 1 and Stage 2. The U.S. is simultaneously exhibiting characteristics of both Stage 1 and Stage 2, something historically rare and extremely dangerous. Stage 1 indicators: fiscal overreach, record national debt, persistent deficits, expansive military commitments, increasing entitlement spending, currency dilution through monetary expansion. These are the same pressures that preceded the decline of every major empire. Stage 2 indicators: institutional erosion, rising political polarization, public distrust at record highs, declining efficiency in governance, corruption scandals, agencies failing to solve basic issues, regulatory gridlock. Institutions appear strong, but function weakly. This is exactly how Stage 2 looks in every historical example. 2. The social environment. Signs of Stage 3. Most Americans feel something is off. Not collapsing, but not stable either. That feeling is historically significant. Stage 3 does not look like chaos. It looks like division. Current indicators: class tension between economic groups, cultural and ideological fragmentation, rapid loss of trust in media, government, finance, widening urban versus rural divides, increasing political hostility, declining faith in a shared national identity. These are the same early warning signals seen in late-stage France and the late Soviet period. 3. Where the U.S. stands today. The U.S. is not yet in Stage 4. But historically, the distance between Stage 3 and Stage 4 is extremely short once momentum builds. A single triggering event, economic, political, or geopolitical, could accelerate the transition. And history shows that once stage 4 begins, the decline speeds up dramatically. Chapter 6. Global Parallels. Other nations in the playbook. The United States is not the only nation showing signs of accelerated internal decline. Around the world, several countries are moving through the 4-stage collapse cycle, some slowly, others with alarming speed. Understanding these global parallels helps clarify the broader pattern. Because collapses rarely happen in isolation, they tend to cluster, driven by shared economic pressures, demographic trends, and political incentives. Let's examine a few of the most notable cases. 1. The United Kingdom. Late stage 2, early stage 3. The UK does not face imminent collapse, but the structural signals are unmistakable. Stage 1 legacies. Decades of debt accumulation, massive government spending expansion, currency dilution after 2008 and 2020, growing fiscal imbalance. Stage 2 symptoms. Declining institutional effectiveness, political churn for prime ministers in 6 years, rising public distrust in government and media, stagnant productivity. Stage 3 fractures. Scotland, England tensions, class resentment, and regional inequality, economic stress on households. The UK is an example of a slow-moving decline, not dramatic, not catastrophic, but unmistakably aligned with the early to mid stages of the playbook. 2. France, Stage 3 instability. Modern France mirrors aspects of its pre-revolutionary past, not in severity, but in structure. Signs include violent street protests, deep class divisions, intense political polarization, declining trust in institutions, rising cost of living pressures, heavy fiscal burden on the state. France is not on the verge of collapse, but its social fragmentation is real, and historically, this is the stage that can accelerate quickly when pressure increases. 3. Argentina, a chronic stage 4 nation. Argentina is a unique example, a country trapped in a repeating loop of collapse and attempted recovery. It cycles through a fiscal overreach, currency devaluation, institutional dysfunction, social anger, external shock, system reset. Argentina shows that governments can technically survive repeated collapses, but the cost is chronic instability. This is what happens when the playbook repeats faster than institutions can rebuild. 4. China, rising tensions between stages. China is difficult to categorize precisely, but the internal pressure is growing in ways that echo early-stage decline patterns. Stage 1 traits. Enormous debt expansion, a real estate bubble, massive state-backed overspending, demographic collapse, long-term pressure. Stage 2 traits. Institutional opacity, corruption concentration, centralized decision-making vulnerabilities. Stage 3 risks. Public frustration with economic slowdown, youth unemployment pressures, and regional disparities. China is not in collapse, but the structural vulnerabilities are significant, especially when mapped to the historical pattern. Chapter 7. The modern collapse landscape. We now reach the most important question of this entire episode. What does collapse look like in the modern world? It rarely resembles the fall of Rome, or the French Revolution, or the Soviet breakup. It looks different now, quieter, faster, driven more by economics than by armies. Here are the modern signs of Stage 4, the signals that a nation has crossed the final threshold. Modern Stage 4 signals. 1. Rapid currency devaluation. A failing currency is the clearest sign of systemic breakdown. Once confidence is lost, governments can no longer stabilize value. 2. Breakdown in public trust. When citizens stop believing in government, media, or institutions, collapse accelerates. 3. Institutional paralysis. Laws become difficult to pass. Reforms are blocked. Bureaucracies fail. 4. Decline in international confidence. Foreign investors withdraw. Credit ratings fall. The currency weakens further. 5. Triggering shock. A financial crisis. A geopolitical event. A political scandal. A sudden economic downturn. This is the spark, but the collapse is already baked in. 2. How fast can collapse happen today? Extremely fast. Because the modern world is more interconnected than any civilization in history. Digital markets react instantly. Capital flows move in microseconds. Political scandals spread globally in minutes. Confidence evaporates with a single headline. If France or Rome collapsed in decades, Modern nations can collapse in months. Confidence is no longer tied to physical borders. It is tied to digital networks, and those networks react instantly. Chapter 8. Synthesis. What the pattern tells us. Throughout this episode, we've explored three major empires, multiple modern nations, and the foundational four-stage collapse cycle. Now we bring it together. What does history actually teach us? 1. Collapse is predictable. The signals appear long before the fall. 2. Collapse is internal. External forces only expose what was already dying within. 3. Collapse follows incentives. When incentives reward short-term gain over long-term stability, decline is inevitable. 4. Collapse accelerates near the end. Years of decay turn into rapid breakdown. 5. Collapse is a transformation, not an ending. Nations don't disappear. They reorganize under new structures, new elites, new priorities. The modern world is entering a period where many nations face these pressures simultaneously. Debt crises, institutional distrust, social division, currency instability, geopolitical shocks. History does not repeat, but patterns do. And this pattern is becoming harder to ignore. Chapter 9. Final warning. There is one lesson repeated across every empire we've studied. A nation that fails to recognize its own stage in the collapse cycle cannot avoid the consequences of that cycle. The leaders of Rome ignored the warning signs. So did the kings of France. So did the Soviet hierarchy. And today, other nations are doing the same. The danger is not the shock. The danger is the denial. Because once stage 4 begins, the speed of decline leaves no time for course correction. Collapse is not a mystery. It is a process, a predictable one, a visible one. And right now, nations around the world are moving through it, some slowly, some rapidly. History is whispering. The question is whether anyone is listening. If you found this breakdown useful, if you want to understand the patterns shaping economies, currencies, and collapses, consider joining us here at Decoded Finance. We explore the cycles behind every crisis, the hidden incentives behind every collapse, the lessons that history repeats again and again. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because the next episode will reveal another pattern shaping the world right now. History leaves clues. Follow them with us, and prepare for the stage that comes next.